The drums did not beat for joy that evening. They sounded like slow thunder rolling over the hills, dragging a sense of dread through the dying light. The sun melted behind the dusty rooftops of Kwanzaa, painting the horizon with the colors of rust and sorrow. People gathered along the road, whispering as if every breath carried bad news. Everyone knew the reason. Aminata Okoro, the daughter of the proudest man in the region, was being forced to marry the one man her father despised beyond measure, Ezekiel Mabunda. Even the wind that day moved differently, heavy with pity. Women pulled their wraps tighter, men lowered their gazes, and children were hushed by anxious mothers. A wedding, yes, but not one meant for joy. It was a performance of pride and politics, stitched together by old grudges and stubborn power. Aminata walked between the elder women, her body trembling, her spirit trying to stand tall. Her dress was plain and pale, sewn by her late mother long ago for a celebration that never happened. Now it hung around her like armor made of silk, too fragile to defend, too honest to hide her fear. Her bare feet touched warm earth, her thoughts drifting between prayer and surrender. When the elders called her forward, every whisper in the square died. No flutes, no laughter, only the steady rhythm of the drums and the low rustle of gossip. Aminata dared to look up once. Her father stood at the front, chin raised, pride gleaming where compassion should have been. And though he said nothing, his look carried words sharp as a blade. Obey. This is bigger than you. You do not belong to yourself. Across from her, her future husband waited. Ezekiel Mabunda, the man whose name children spoke in hushes, the legendary rival. Tall, broad-shouldered, eyes unreadable. He didn't smile, didn't even glance her way, as if to meet her gaze might admit guilt. He looked instead at the mountain ridge beyond the square. Hard, cold, unyielding, like a man accustomed to losing everything but his pride. The elder's voice rose above the uneasy air. Today we unite two houses in the name of peace. But there was no peace there, only the echo of a war too old to remember its origin and too bitter to forget. Aminata's lips moved mechanically as she repeated the vow. Her voice cracked. Each word felt borrowed, pulled unwillingly from her chest. When the elder declared the marriage complete, the crowd didn't cheer. They simply exhaled in relief, like those finishing a punishment. Faces turned away quickly. A few women murmured pity beneath their breath. The men returned to their business, pretending this uneasy peace was a triumph of wisdom, though everyone knew it was nothing but exhaustion disguised as diplomacy. And so, while the drums slowed into silence, the bride began her uncertain walk toward her new home, the home of her father's sworn enemy. The Mabunda compound stood at the edge of the village, half hidden behind old trees and walls streaked with years of smoke. No garlands, no music, not even the courtesy of a lantern. The air inside was colder than the dusk outside. A short servant bowed and stepped back after closing the door behind her. The sound of the wooden latch falling into place rang in her ears like the ceiling of a tomb. Ezekiel walked beside her without a word. Not tender, not cruel, just silent. He gestured to the small room that would be hers, then vanished down the corridor. She stood alone in the dimness, the weight of quiet pressing from every wall. When she finally sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her legs trembled from more than fatigue. She felt the vast loneliness of exile, even as she remained within hearing distance of the only village she had ever known. The tears came then, slowly, quietly, marking her cheeks like invisible rivers. She pressed her palms together and buried her face. Outside, cicadas sang. The wind moved through the palm leaves like someone whispering comfort that words couldn't deliver. In the darkness, the elder's voice returned to her mind. Today we unite two houses in the name of peace. But what kind of peace began with tears? What kind of peace demanded the life of an obedient daughter as payment for the arrogance of old men? That question had no answer. Only silence replied. Days turned into nights and nights into stretches of emptiness. Aminata moved about the house softly, taking note of its ghostly stillness. The clay walls, cracked and bare, reflected shadows more faithfully than they did light. A wounded roof let in beams of sun that only seemed to reveal dust rather than warmth. Every corner felt haunted, not by spirits but by unspoken stories. Ezekiel kept pattern like clockwork. He rose before dawn, his footsteps deliberate, his shoulders squared like a soldier marching to a war that existed only in his mind. Each evening, he returned long after the sun had melted into darkness. His clothes smelled of sweat and metal and forest wind, but he spoke no word to explain his toil. When Aminata greeted him politely, his replies, if any, were only nods or short, flat murmurs that carried no weight. She had expected cruelty. She had feared it. But what met her each day was something quieter and crueler. Indifference. He neither loved her nor punished her. He simply didn't see her. At night, she lay awake listening to the pulse of rural silence, frogs croaking near the well, dogs whining at distant travelers, the restless call of the wind through cracked wood. She would imagine her mother's voice again, gentle and protective, guiding her through the dark. But when she opened her eyes, there was nothing. Not even the outline of comfort. Some nights she whispered prayers to anyone who might listen. To ancestors, to forgotten gods, to herself. She prayed not for freedom but for feeling. To feel something again besides emptiness. Morning after morning, she tidied the yard, cooked porridge that cooled untouched, swept rooms that no one walked through. Ezekiel passed her like smoke. It wasn't violence, but his silence burned all the same. Sometimes she paused and remembered her grandmother's words. A house without voices is a house without a soul. The old woman had been right. Without laughter, without chatter, a home became nothing but stone standing on earth, a grave too wide to fill. Finally one evening, Aminata decided that silence could no longer swallow her whole. While Ezekiel sat at the low table, eating methodically, she steadied her breath. Her voice, small but steady, broke the air between them. Do you need more water? He lifted his eyes briefly, only long enough to shake his head before looking down again. The brief encounter stabbed deeper than a shout. That small flicker of attention, and the cold return to indifference, made her chest ache. She turned away quickly, hiding the sting in her eyes. What hurt wasn't rejection itself, but the realization that she had become invisible to the one person tied to her destiny. Yet that night, lying in her corner, something subtle stirred inside her. A faint current beneath still waters. A small flame that did not yet know its name. Aminata could not have said whether it was anger, courage, or awakening, but it was something alive. Something that whispered that her story was not over, no matter how tightly silence tried to seal it. And in that quiet house, where no words dared linger, silence began to tremble for the first time. Aminata, though weary, did not resign herself completely. There were moments when she remembered the hymns from the village church, where women sang verses asking for strength to endure life's pains. She would close her eyes and repeat some of those verses silently, not as one who expects an immediate miracle, but as one who clings to a small, fragile flame that refuses to go out. And so days became weeks, and weeks became months. Life moved on like a slow river, but one without color, without birdsong, without flowers along its banks. Only the repetitive flow of silence until one day, while tidying up a forgotten corner of the house, Aminata found something that would change the way she saw that distant man, and the hatred dividing their two families. But before that revelation, she still had to endure many nights of solitude, feeling the emptiness of the home as the most silent and cruel pain she could ever know. It was an ordinary morning, one of those when the wind blew red dust across the yard and the rooster kept crowing. Even though the sun had long since risen, Aminata had woken early as always, but her body felt heavy. The silence of the house once again seemed to crush her chest. There were no words, no human warmth, only bare walls, and the repetitive sound of Ezekiel's footsteps as he left early without looking back. She decided then to pass the time by tidying a room that was rarely used. It was a small space filled with old boxes and furniture draped in thick cloth where dust had gathered as if it were guarding secrets. Aminata pulled the cover from a dark wooden chest, and upon opening it found objects stored as if they were forbidden memories. Among old clothes and yellowed papers were letters carefully folded. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the first letter. She recognized familiar names. Okoro. She saw dates from years before she was even born. Each line painted a portrait of the old rivalry. But what surprised her wasn't the tone of hatred, as she had always heard in the elder stories, but rather how much pride was rooted in every word. The letters revealed that the feud between the families had begun over a piece of land, a fertile field near the river, disputed for generations, each side swearing it was rightfully theirs. There was no original crime, no blood spilled from betrayal, only pride, mistrust, and the weight of a past no one had dared to let go. Aminata read each letter like someone uncovering a secret that could change her life. She realized that both the Okoros and the Mabundas had fed a fire that could have died out long ago, but that out of pride they chose to keep alive. It was as if the men from both families were incapable of living without a war to call their own. As she closed the last letter, Aminata felt a mixture of indignation and sorrow. Indignation at realizing her life was being sacrificed for a grudge rooted in old vanity. sorrow from the knowledge that perhaps none of the men involved would ever admit it out loud, and she now was the bridge bound in chains, forced to carry a burden that wasn't hers. In the days that followed, that secret never left her mind. While she cooked, while she swept, while she stared at the sky at dusk, the letters returned to her like a calling. The young woman began to see Ezekiel in a different light. She wondered if behind his silence and coldness, there was also a man tired of carrying a legacy he never chose. One night, lying alone, she closed her eyes and remembered her grandmother's words. Sometimes a man's greatest enemy isn't his neighbor, it's his own pride. That memory burned in her mind. It was exactly what the letters had shown. Pride, nothing but pride, building walls between families that could have lived in peace. Aminata began to watch her husband differently. She noticed how he looked out at the horizon when he thought no one was watching. She saw the weight in his shoulders, the way he returned home in silence, bringing neither joy nor glory, only exhaustion. He was a man shaped by harshness, but maybe also imprisoned by it. One afternoon while gathering firewood, Aminata was overtaken by a thought. If this war began with pride, maybe it can end with truth. But fear soon mingled with hope. How could a young woman alone challenge decades of bitterness between two clans? How could her voice be heard when even her own father had silenced her so many times? Even so, she carefully hid the letters again, not to forget them, but to keep them safe. She stored them like a secret flame, a silent weapon she might one day use. For the first time since her forced marriage, Aminata felt a thread of purpose growing inside her. She was not just Ezekiel's wife, not just the obedient daughter of Ans. Now she carried a truth that could expose Thayroot of everyone's pain. That night before sleeping, Aminata knelt on the packed earth floor and murmured a short prayer, almost a whisper. May the weight of truth not destroy me, but make me stronger. Her eyes filled with tears, not of despair, but of something new. The realization that perhaps fate still held a greater role for her than that of a silent victim. And so it was among dust and forgotten papers that Aminata began to see her life through new eyes. Not as that of a woman sold in the name of peace, but as someone who, even insolence, might carry in her hands the key to breaking the chains that proud men had clung to for generations. The silence in that house had become so constant that Aminata now recognized it as part of her daily life, like another piece of furniture, another wall. But that night, after discovering the letters that exposed the root of the hatred between the Okoros and the Mabundas, the silence felt different, as if it were holding a secret on the verge of being revealed. Aminata couldn't sleep. Her eyes stared at the dark ceiling, while the memory of the words written on yellowed paper burned inside her. The pain was no longer just from loneliness, but from carrying a truth that could change everything. Then, without meaning to, she let out a sob. It wasn't a full cry, just a stifled moan, but enough to break the wall of silence. Ezekiel, who until then had seemed indifferent to her presence, heard it. He approached the bedroom door, and for the first time since the wedding, stopped before entering, no longer rushing past. There was hesitation in his steps, as if he were battling something within himself. Aminata tried to hold back the tears, but it was too late. When Ezekiel entered the room, he found her sitting on the edge of the bed, shoulders slumped, face buried in her hands. There was nothing theatrical in her crying. It was the silent weeping of a woman, exhausted from carrying more than she should ever have to bear. For a moment, the austere man everyone knew seemed to vanish, and in his place stood someone more human, someone who also carried invisible wounds. He stood in silence for a few seconds, watching her as if unsure of what to say. Then in a low, hoarse voice he said, "I don't intend to hurt you." The words sounded strange in the air, like they didn't quite belong to the man used to living with rigidity and rivalry. Aminata lifted her face, surprised. She had expected coldness, contempt, even indifference, but not that simple confession. Stripped of pride, Ekiel, avoiding her gaze, continued, "I only accepted this marriage to hurt your father. It was my way of proving to him that despite all the hatred, he couldn't defeat me." The young woman felt her heart tighten even more. Her marriage, her life, her body, all of it had been used as a tool in a war that wasn't hers. For a moment she felt revolt, but when she looked at Thaman before her, she saw something she had never expected: regret. Ezekiel's shoulders were hunched, not from age, but from the weight of years of bitterness. It was as if he were finally admitting, at least to her, that the war had taken more than it had ever given. His voice didn't carry the tone of someone justifying himself, but of someone who was simply tired, still crying. Aminata asked in a trembling voice, "So you never wanted me as your wife?" The question came out heavy with pain, but also with a need to understand. He took a deep breath, paused for a few seconds, and replied, "I don't want your pain. I only want the peace your father never gave me. Those words pierced her heart like a blade and at the same time like a bomb. It was painful to admit there was neither love nor desire in that union. But there was also a sense of relief in realizing she wouldn't be treated as an enemy in that house. Ezekiel didn't want her as a wife, but he didn't want to destroy her either. Silence settled between them once more. But this time it was different. Not the heavy, oppressive silence of the early days, but a silence full of revelations, as if both were finally seeing the human pain hidden behind their masks. For the first time, Aminata didn't see him only as the Okuro enemy, but as a weary man, bound by chains as heavy as her own. That night, Aminata didn't sleep. She spent the hours reflecting on every word, every gesture. She remembered the hidden letters and felt an invisible thread connecting those truths to what he had just told her. The feud between their families was a prison consuming everyone involved. And now, for the first time, she saw Ezekiel not as the jailer, but as a cell dot. At sunrise, Aminata went to fetch water from the river. As she walked with the bucket balanced on her head, she felt that something inside her had shifted. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't trust, but it was a first step. The enemy had revealed a human face, and that made her realize there might be space for a new story, even if no one believed in it. Ezekiel never spoke of that night again, but his gaze had changed. There was less hardness in it, less stone. Aminata noticed that beneath the layers of pride was a man who also longed for peace, but simply didn't know how to reach it. And that discovery, though quiet, would be the beginning of an unlikely alliance that would change not only their lives, but the fate of the entire village. The sun had already set when Aminata finally gathered her courage. For days, Ezekiel's words had echoed inside her like a distant drum, resounding without rest. I don't want your pain. I only want the peace your father never gave me. Those words had wounded her, but they also revealed something she could no longer ignore. Her life wasn't the result of denied love, but of a war between men who refused to let go of the past. She walked slowly through the house, as if each step were part of a ritual, preparing her for a confrontation she could no longer avoid. The silence between them was no longer enough. She needed to hear the whole truth, even if it hurt more than the wounds she already carried in her heart. She found Ezekiel sitting in the yard under the shade of the mango tree, staring into nothing. He looked tired, arms resting on his knees like someone holding up the weight of the world. Aminata took a deep breath, stepped closer, and broke the silence. So you never wanted me as a wife. Her voice didn't come out as an accusation but as a plea. It was the voice of someone who needed to understand what ground she was standing on, even if it was cold and hard. Ezekiel looked up at her, waited a few seconds, and answered calmly without raising his voice. I never wanted your pain. The words came slowly, as if they weighed on his tongue. He continued. I didn't seek your body or your company. I accepted this marriage to wound your father to prove that he couldn't control me. But when I saw you enter this house, I realized I hadn't won anything. I had only brought another victim into a war that was never yours. Aminata felt her legs weakened. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or shattered. Her whole life since the day the marriage was announced. She had believed she was unwanted because she wasn't desirable. Now she saw it was more than that. It wasn't about a lack of beauty or value as a woman. It was about being used as currency in a game of bitterness. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. And what do you expect of me now? That I be silence in this house? That I carry the weight of humiliation and say nothing? Ezekiel looked at her, and for the first time there was something different in his eyes. A glimmer as if he were allowing himself to be truly seen. I only hope you won't hate me the way your father hates me, he said. I hope that someday you'll understand that I too am a prisoner of this feud. More than your husband. I'm a hostage of a war I never chose. I'm Minata's heart split in two. Part of her wanted to scream, accuse, spit on the ground, and swear she would never live as a shadow. But another part, deeper, quieter, recognized the bitter truth in his words. Ezekiel was no executioner nor a lover. He was a tired man, shaped by generations that never learned to yield. She sat back down, too drained to argue further. The night breeze brought with it the scent of damp earth, as if nature itself were listening to their conversation. The silence that returned wasn't empty like before. It was a silence heavy with revelations that changed everything. That night, Aminata cried again, but her tears weren't only of loneliness anymore. They were tears of understanding. She cried for herself, for Ezekiel, for her father, and for all those who had fed a senseless war. She cried because she now realized she bore the scars in body and soul of a resentment that was never hers. Azaku on the other side of the room said nothing else, but for the first time, the space between them didn't feel distant. There was a quiet sharing, a recognition that both were wounded, both were victims, and within that shared pain, something unexpected began to take root, the seed of an unlikely alliance. The shock of the truth didn't free Aminata in that moment, but it gave her something even more precious. Clarity, and with clarity, even in the midst of pain, hope can begin to find a way to be born. The days that followed that night of revelations were different. The silence in the house still lingered, but it was no longer the same silence as before. There was a quiet recognition in it, as if Aminata and Ezekiel, without exchanging many words, already understood that something bound them beyond the forced bond of marriage. They were not husband and wife, as the village expected, but neither were they enemies, as their parents had dictated. They were two prisoners of the same cage, learning to breathe together within the invisible bars that surrounded them. Amin, however, could no longer pretend that her life would be only about surviving in silence. The letters she had discovered, Ezekiel's confession, all of it had ignited a growing desire inside her to break the chains of rivalry. It was no longer just about her personal pain, but about a collective wound that had bled the village for generations. One night, as Ezekiel prepared to leave once again on his usual routine, she found the courage to speak. Her voice was steady but full of emotion. "If you don't want me as a wife, then at least allow me to find a purpose in this house. Let me help you end this war." Ezekiela stopped, looking at her in surprise. It was the first time Aminata had spoken to him that way, without fear, without shrinking before him. There was fire in her eyes, a flame he hadn't expected to find in the young woman who had entered his home with silent tears. He took a deep breath, as if weighing a difficult decision. Then he replied, his tone lower than usual. "You speak like someone older than your years, but your courage surprises me. If you wish to walk that path, no, it won't be easy. The men in this village don't take kindly to women involving themselves in their wars. And your father? Your father will call you a traitor." Aminata held his gaze. "I was betrayed the day he gave me away like a bargaining chip. I no longer fear that name." Ezekiel fell silent for a few moments. It was as if he were wrestling with the pride that had always guided him, and at the same time recognizing that this young woman was right. After all, even he no longer believed in the strength of the feud. What kept the hatred alive weren't unforgivable crimes, but wounds fed by blind pride. "Very well," he said at last. "If that is your will, we'll be allies, but it must remain our secret. It's not yet time to bear the weight of both families." In that moment, something shifted between them. They were no longer just husband and wife bound by fate. They had become allies, companions in a cause greater than either of them. There were no promises of love, no sentimental declarations, but there was an understanding that together they might attempt the impossible to break the chains of resentment that had suffocated generations. From that day on, their conversations, still few, took on a new tone. Aminata began to share with Ezekiel what she had read in the letters. He listened in silence, sometimes with a furrowed brow, sometimes with a deep sigh, like someone who recognized the truth but struggled to accept it. Over time, even his gestures began to change. He no longer passed through the house like an indifferent ghost. There was more presence in him now, a willingness to listen, even if he remained restrained. For Amata, this new bond, this quiet beginning of complicity, was a silent victory. It wasn't the love many women dreamed of when they married, but it was something that gave her the strength to remain standing. For the first time, she felt that her life had a purpose beyond submission. It was as if she had found within her captivity the key to fight for freedom. Not just Hiron, but for the whole village. But deep down they both knew that their alliance would come at a price. Nothing stayed hidden for long in Kwanzaa. Suspicious glances, the neighbors' whispers, the weight of tradition. Everything conspired against them. Even so, Aminata was resolute. She had cried in silence for too long. Now, even if no one believed her, even if they called her mad or a traitor, she would carry within herself the flame of a hope that could no longer be extinguished. Ezekiel, by her side, quietly discovered something he had never admitted before, that the young woman he had accepted only as a pawn in the game against the Okoros now showed him a courage he himself had long lost. It was as if Aminata, with her faith and determination, was slowly restoring to him the humanity that war had stolen. And so began a secret alliance made of glances exchanged insolence, of words spoken at dusk, of truths shared that could not yet be revealed to the world. And in that silent pact, the possibility of a new story was born, not just for them, but for all who lived under the shadow of the Okoroma Banda feud. Time passed and the secret alliance between Aminata and Ezekiel began to take shape, timid and fragile like a flame lit against the wind. They met in quiet conversations at night when the weight of the day began to fade, and exchanged words meant for neither ears. Aminata shared the memories revealed to her by the letters, and Ezekiel little by little began to admit how much that war had drained from his life. But outside the walls of their home, the reality was very different. The village still saw them not as two human beings trying to make sense of tragedy, but as living symbols of a rivalry still burning. To the Okoro, Aminata was the daughter given to the enemy. To the Mabunda, she was the token that proved Ezekiel's victory over On. No one imagined that inside that house, hatred had already begun to give way to an unlikely alliance. One day, Aminata made the decision that would change the course of everything to try to bring both sides closer. It was no longer enough to keep the letters secret, or to speak only with the weight of the truth she carried wouldn't let her sleep. She believed that if she showed them the root of the feud, maybe the cycle could finally be broken. Her first attempt was to visit her mother. Some women of the Okoro clan whispered behind her back, mocking in low voices, "Look at her. The daughter who sleeps in the enemy's bed now wants to give peace lessons." Aminata heard the suppressed laughter, but said nothing. Her heart ached, but her steps remained firm. When she entered, she found her father sitting on the porch, surrounded by men of the clan. With courage, she spoke in front of them. "Father, we must stop this war. There's no sense in continuing anymore." Anselmo rose slowly, and his face, hardened by time, showed not a flicker of compassion. "You, my own daughter, dare speak to me of peace. After lying in the house of my enemy, you have the nerve to lecture me about honor." His words cut through her like knives. The men around him laughed with disdain, and one of the women serving water said loudly, "No woman ever settles a man's fight." Her heart felt heavier than all the jars of water she had carried as a child. It wasn't just rejection. It was betrayal by her own family, who now saw her not as a daughter, but as a traitor. Aminata tried to reply, but the knot in her throat held her back. She simply lowered her eyes and silently gathered the paint had burned inside her. That night, returning home, she found Ezekiel sitting and waiting. The silence between them said more than any question. She murmured only, "They tried to silence me. They called me a traitor." Ezekiel sighed deeply, staring at the ground. "Your father is proud, prouder than the disputed land. He would rather lose a daughter than let go of the grudge that feeds him." Despite the pain, Aminata lifted her eyes with resolve. "Even so, I won't give up. If they won't listen to me, they'll listen to the truth I discovered." In the days that followed, the mockery intensified. The women of the village turned their backs on her. Children repeated out loud what they'd heard from the adults. "That's the traitor who chose to live with the enemy." Aminata endured each word as if it were a stone thrown against her dignity. But inside her, the flame would not die. She knew there was something greater than the scorn of others. The possibility of freeing the entire village from a hatred that had consumed generations. That it was during that time that Aminata began to realize the greatest obstacle wasn't just that men armed with pride. It was also the collective mindset that said women had no voice. She, a young woman with no weapons, no title, no power, dared to touch a wound everyone else pretended didn't exist. That was more offensive than any open war. Azakula, watching her courage, began to admire her in silence. Though he never said it aloud, he no longer saw her as just the enemy's daughter or the wife forced upon him. Hess saw in her a strength he himself had long lost, a strength born from rejection, humiliation, and the pain of being discredited. And so Aminata remained standing, insulted, rejected, branded a traitor. Every word thrown at her was another weight on her shoulders, but also another reminder that her fight was not a small one. While everyone tried to silence her, she came to understand that her voice was exactly what could open the path to change. The resistance from both families was fierce, but amid the scorn and accusation, Aminata discovered her true identity. Not just a daughter, not just a wife, but a woman who dared to challenge the chains that kept the entire village in bondage. The rejection Aminata suffered in her own home could have been the final blow to her soul. It could have silenced her as it had silenced so many other women crushed under the weight of men's pride. But instead of quieting her, the pain became fuel. Every insult, every mocking laugh, every pointed finger only fed the flame burning inside her. It was as if humiliation had become fertile soil where her courage could grow steady and unexpected. She began devoting her days to digging deeper into the roots of therivalry that had destroyed so many lives. She returned to the letters hidden in the old chest, reading the words written decades before. The more she studied, the more she realized how history had been distorted over the years. Small disagreements had turned into offenses, offenses into fights, fights into deaths. But underneath it all, the origin was always the same. A fertile piece of land by the river, long coveted, and turned into a symbol of pride and dominance. Aminata came to understand that if it hadn't been that field, it would have been something else. The hatred was never truly about the land. It was about the pride of men who didn't know how to give in. That realization filled her with anger, but it also gave her strength. Because if the root of all that pain was so petty, there was still hope it could be pulled out. Armed with the letters in her voice, Aminata began to speak up at village gatherings, not as someone trying to impose authority, but as someone who could no longer carry the silence. The first time she spoke in public, the elders looked at her with disdain. One of them, tapping his cane on the ground, said with bitter irony, "And who are you, girl, to question the word of the men who built this village?" Aminata, unfazed, lifted her head and replied firmly, "I am a daughter of this land, just like any of you. And I'm also the daughter of a man who gave me away like currency to keep alive a grudge he doesn't even understand. How many more lives must be ruined over a piece of land no one even cultivates anymore?" A heavy silence fell over the courtyard. Some of the men scoffed, others exchanged uneasy glances, but the older women began to nod slowly, though they didn't dare speak aloud. With each new attempt, Aminata faced mockery and insults, but she also began to sense that her courage was stirring hearts long dormant. People who had once repeated the old hatred without question now began to doubt. Her own father, Anselmo, grew angrier each time he heard of her actions. To him, her boldness was more shameful than the forced marriage itself. One afternoon, as she walked through the village, Anselmo stopped her in front of everyone. His eyes burned and his voice thundered, "Traitor, you sleep with my enemy and dare lecture me about wisdom." His words echoed, but this time Aminata didn't lower her head. She looked him straight in the eye and said, "I was your daughter before I was anyone's wife, and if that makes me a traitor for wanting peace, then I will carry that name with pride, because I am not the one who betrayed my family. You did when you chose hatred over the life of your own daughter." The shock was immediate. Noon had ever defied Anselmo like that. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some people applauded silently. Others stepped back, afraid of the consequences. Anselmo, consumed by rage, turned his back on her, but the impact had already struck. That night, Aminata returned home with a heavy heart, but also a stronger one. She knew she had crossed a line from which there was no return. She was no longer just an obedient daughter or a forced wife. She was now a voice rising against generations of bitterness. When she told Ezekiel what had happened, she expected rebuke, maybe even fear. But instead, he looked at her for a long time and said softly, "Your courage is greater than that of all the men in this village." It was the first time Ezekiel had openly acknowledged Aminata's worth. And in that moment, she realized that her fight was no longer just against her father's pride or the silence of the clans, but against an entire culture that believed women had no right to raise their voices. Even alone, even rejected, Aminata was determined to keep going, because she had uncovered a truth no one else dared to admit. The chains of hatred would only break when someone found the strength to endure the weight of the stones thrown against them without backing down. And that strength she now knew could no longer be taken from her. The village of Kwanzaa buzzed with anticipation that day. A great assembly had been called, and everyone expected it to be yet another exchange of accusations between the Okoros and the Mabunda. It was always the same. Men gathered, spoke loudly, beat their chests, and in the end, nothing changed. But that morning, a different rumor drifted through the dusty streets. Word was that as the stern leader of them was going to say something unexpected. Aminata walked through the crowd, her heart racing. She didn't know exactly what would happen, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes. She carried within her the memory of long conversations with Ezekiel, of revelations shared in silence, of the secret alliance that now began to take shape. Maybe at last something was about to change. The assembly gathered in the central square, beneath the great tree that had witnessed every decision the village had ever made. The elders sat on mats. Themans surrounded them, standing tall, while the women remained at the margins, watching from a distance, as was always imposed. Aminata's father, Anselmo Okora, was among the first to arrive. Hei's expression hardened, eyes gleaming with pride. When Ezekiel stood, the murmuring stopped. He was not a man of many public words, but when he spoke, his voice carried weight. He rose slowly, leaning on his staff, and looked around before beginning. "For many years, we have fed this war like a fire that could never go out. I carried that fire in me, believing it gave me strength. But today I understand it was only chains." Eyes darted between faces, confused. Some men frowned, others scoffed, but Ezekiel went on unshaken. "Everyone believes I took Anselmo's daughter as a wife, but the truth is different. I didn't take her as a wife. I took her as a witness to the truth." Shock rippled through the crowd. Voices rose in loud murmurs. Some women covered their mouths in disbelief, and Anselmo leapt to his feet in fury. "How dare you!" he bellowed. "My daughter is no witness. You stole her as you've always stolen everything." Ezekiel raised a hand for silence. His voice firm cut through the noise. "I didn't steal her. I never touched her as a wife because I never wanted her as a token. I've respected her since the first day, and it was she with her courage who made me see that the hatred we carry is nothing but empty pride." All eyes turned to Aminata. She stood still, but her eyes shone with emotion. For the first time, someone had spoken aloud what she had carried in her heart, that her pain had not been in vain, that her dignity had remained intact. Ezekiel continued, his voice rising. Today, before everyone here, I say that my greatest desire is not to defeat, nor to possess land, nor to keep this feud alive. My greatest desire is to end this cycle of hatred that has cost us sons, brothers, even our peace of mind. A heavy silence fell over the assembly. It was a silence of shock, of disbelief, but also of reflection. Some men lowered their heads as if recognizing a truth they had long tried to deny. The women discreetly exchanged glances, and in some eyes tears began to form, but Anselmo couldn't bear it. He stepped forward and roared, "You speak like a coward! You hide behind pretty words because you can't beat me in honor." But Ezekiel stood firm. Calmly he replied, "It's not cowardice and it's courage. Courage to admit I wasted years of my life on a meaningless war. Courage to recognize that your daughter is wiser than both of us put together." His words landed like stones on Anselmo's heart. No one had ever publicly acknowledged Aminata before, least of all in front of her father. For the first time, a man's authority was not only challenged by the daughter who dared to speak, but by every enemy who now praised her. The assembly ended in murmurs and tension. But the seed had been planted. Ezekiel had shocked everyone, not only by defending Ami, but by standing against the weight of tradition that had kept the families locked in hatred. That night, as she walked back home, Aminata felt something different in her chest. For the first time since the forced marriage, she didn't feel invisible. She was no longer just a traded token, a rejected daughter, an ignored wife. She was now publicly acknowledged as a witness to the truth. And though the war was far from over, something had already changed forever. Because on that day, Ezekiel had not only surprised the village, he had surprised himself by speaking aloud what he had only ever dared to whisper in secret. The assembly had left the village of Kwanzaa in turmoil. For days, the same conversations echoed in homes, along the riverbanks and on the dusty paths. Ezekiel confessed he never took Aminata as his wife. Some spoke with shock, others with mockery, and a few more observant with quiet respect. But no one remained indifferent. It was as if the words spoken beneath the great tree had cracked open the heart of the community, revealing that maybe this war wasn't an unbreakable wall, but simply a barrier built by pride. Still, the tension grew. Aminata's father, Onelmo, walked the village like a wounded man, his authority shaken in front of everyone. He avoided looking at his daughter, and when he did, his eyes burned with restrained fury. But Aminata no longer shrank under his gaze. The weight of rejection was still there. But now it was laced with a new strength born from the courage of speaking out and the unexpected recognition from Azaku. A few days later, a new gathering was called, even larger than the last. Men and women from the entire village showed up. There was anticipation in the air, as if everyone could sense something decisive was about to happen, and indeed it was. Ezekiel stood before them all. His face was calm, but there was resolve in his stance. He looked over the assembly and spoke in a clear voice. "Today, before you all, I make the most important decision of my life. I publicly request a divorce from Aminata Okoro." A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Some women gasped behind their hands. Some men frowned. Anselmo stood abruptly, furious. But this time he had no chance to speak. Ezekiel continued, "I do not leave her as one who rejects. I release her as one who returns the freedom that should never have been taken. I never took her as a true wife, and I will not allow her to carry the stain of a marriage she never chose. Aminato is innocent, and her honor remains intact before you all." The words echoed like thunder. For a moment, silence reigned. Even the birds seemed to fall quiet. It was the first time a man in public restored a woman's dignity after an imposed marriage. It was a gesture unthinkable to many, yet one powerful enough to break tradition. Aminata, hearing those words, felt her heart race. She wept not from pain, but from deep relief for the first time since she had been forced into marriage. Someone had spoken aloud the truth she carried, within that her life could not be reduced to a deal between families, and overcome with rage shouted, "This is dishonor! This is humiliation upon my name!" But before he could continue, one of the elders interrupted him. It was the oldest in the village, a man whose voice rarely rose, but whose words all respected. "No one. What brings dishonor is the war we've carried for too long. What humiliates us is watching sons and grandsons live as enemies over a piece of land. Today, this man shows us that peace is still possible." The elders' words fell like a seal of truth. Murmurs of agreement began to spread. Other elders, silent until then, nodded. Even some women, once quiet, raised their voices to say, "Enough hatred. It's time for reconciliation." And so something unthinkable happened. The families began to draw closer. Not instantly, not perfectly, but the tabble that had long been split in two slowly became one. For the first time in decades, Okoro and Maba shared food, space, and a silence free of bitterness. Aminata watched it all with teary eyes. She felt her suffering had not been in vain. Her forced marriage, her loneliness, her rejection, all had become a bridge to something greater. Ezekiel, in granting her freedom, had not only freed her as a woman, but freed entire families from a senseless war. That day, the young woman once traded like currency became a symbol of reconciliation. The man once seen as a ruthless enemy revealed himself to be just by restoring her dignity, and the father, once blinded by hatred, was forced to face a truth he had always denied, that his daughter, the one he'd called a traitor, was now the voice uniting what he had helped to divide. The village would never be the same. That divorce, which many expected to be a stain, became a sign of liberation, and reconciliation, once thought impossible, was born from the courage of a rejected daughter and the choice of a former enemy who at last dared to choose peace. Aminata's story swept through the village of Kwanzaa like a fresh wind crossing houses and fields, bringing relief where once there had only been dust. Many still whispered behind closed doors, unable to accept so quickly the end of a rivalry that had marked generations. But even among the most resistant, there was a different kind of silence in the air, as if everyone knew something had changed forever. The young woman who had entered a forced marriage, as if walking to war, her own sentence was now seen as the bridge between two families who had only ever met to clash. Aminata had not earned this place with weapons or with shouting, but with the courage to endure rejection, mockery and insult without ever falling silent. Her pain, which could have drowned her into silence, had become a voice for the entire community. Ezekiel, for his part, ceased to be just the stern enemy, Theman shaped by hatred. By returning Aminata's freedom, he revealed a side few believed could exist. He proved that even those who had spent their whole lives clinging to grudges could still choose dignity over revenge. His gesture did not diminish him in the eyes of the village. It elevated him. Many men who once saw only the face of rivalry in him now looked at him with quiet respect. And Selmo, Aminata's father, may have been the one who suffered most through it all. The pride he had worn like armor for his whole life began to crack. In front of the assembly, in front of his own daughter, he had been disarmed. He could no longer label her a traitor, for everyone saw her courage had surpassed his. He was forced to face the truth he had long denied, that the hatred he had fed for decades had brought him no victories, only isolation and loss. In the village, reconciliation began slowly but genuinely. For the first time in many years, members of both families shared the same table. What had once been seen as betrayal now became a symbol of hope. Children, who had been taught to distrust one another, began to play together. The women, who for so long had carried the pain of this feud in silence, now sighed with relief, sensing that perhaps their children would not inherit the same chains. Sitting by the river on a quiet afternoon, reflected on everything she had lived through. She remembered the girl who had cried alone on the night of her wedding, believing her life would be nothing more than a cycle of pain and abandonment. Now she saw herself as a woman who had turned humiliation into strength. She hadn't had a choice in her marriage, but she had chosen how to carry her pain, and that choice had changed the destiny of many. There were still scars, of course. Resentment does not vanish overnight, but the village had learned something essential, that peace can be born even from a marriage of convenience. If someone is brave enough to turn pain into a bridge, instead of a wall in the memory of the community, Aminata would not be remembered as a rejected wife, but as the daughter who dared to challenge heavy traditions with the strength of her voice. People would speak of her in hushed, reverent tones. She was the traitor who brought peace, the rejected daughter who became the wisdom of us all. And so the story took on the tone of a quiet lesson. Fate, so often cruel, revealed itself also as just, because even when it seemed Aminata would be remembered only through her suffering, it was precisely from that suffering that her victory was born. As the elders would say around the fire, fate may delay, but it never fails the just. And the silence of a woman may one day become the cry that silences generations of hatred. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our